The courtroom was silent, the air thick with tension. Every pair of eyes in the room was fixed on the tiny figure standing in the middle of it all, a 9-year-old girl with wide, determined eyes. She clutched the edge of the witness stand, her small hands barely reaching the surface. Despite her age, there was no fear in her expression, only a quiet strength that seemed to unnerve the powerful figures around her. Across the room, a uniformed officer leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips. He clearly didn't think she was worth his time. The judge, an older man with a cold, calculating gaze, adjusted his glasses as he peered down at her. His expression was skeptical, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. A child daring to stand up against an officer of the law. The lawyer standing beside the girl placed a reassuring hand on the desk, but she didn't need it. She wasn't just here to speak. She was here to be heard. People whispered among themselves in the courtroom. Some shook their heads, doubtful that a little girl could make any difference. Others watched in quiet admiration, sensing something unusual about her. But the one person who wasn't amused was the police officer himself. His smirk faded slightly as he studied her, as if realizing, too late, that she wasn't the scared, helpless child he had expected. The case had already drawn attention. A young black girl standing against an officer of the law wasn't something the system was used to. The accusations were serious, and the stakes were high. If she told the truth and people believed her, it could ruin everything for him. But if she faltered, if she let fear take over, then everything would go back to the way it always had. People like him walking away without consequences. The judge cleared his throat, signaling for the room to settle. The girl's heart pounded, but she refused to show it. She had spent too many nights replaying what had happened, too many hours wondering if she would ever get the chance to make things right. Now, with the courtroom waiting for her words, she knew that moment had come. She looked up, meeting the officer's eyes. He raised an eyebrow, daring her to speak. For a brief second, she saw something behind his confidence, something hidden. Was it doubt? Fear? It was hard to tell. But none of that mattered now. The truth was the truth, and no matter how small she was, no matter how powerful he thought he was, she was going to say it. Taking a deep breath, she opened her mouth to speak. The courtroom remained silent, the weight of anticipation pressing down on everyone inside. The little girl took a steady breath, her fingers gripping the wooden stand as she prepared to speak. The officer leaned forward slightly, his smirk now replaced by something unreadable. The judge tapped his fingers against the bench, waiting. She cleared her throat, her voice soft but unwavering. "I saw what he did," she said. Her words hung in the air, cutting through the thick tension like a blade. The murmur in the courtroom grew louder, people exchanging glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others nodding as if they had been waiting for this moment. The girl's lawyer shifted beside her, watching closely. The officer exhaled, shaking his head like he had just heard the most ridiculous thing in the world. He glanced at the judge with a confident shrug, as if to say, "This is a waste of time." But his eyes, sharp and calculating, flickered with something else, something uneasy. He had been in court before, faced accusations, deflected them with practiced ease. But this was different. The girl continued, her voice growing steadier. "That night, I was outside. I heard yelling, and when I looked, I saw him. He was—" she paused, choosing her words carefully. "He was doing something wrong, and he knew it." The officer scoffed, finally speaking up. "Your Honor, are we really going to sit here and let a child make things up?" His voice was full of false amusement, but there was an edge to it, a slight crack in his confidence. The judge raised a hand, signaling for him to stay quiet. His expression remained unreadable, but there was something in the way he studied the girl, like he was trying to gauge whether she was really as fearless as she seemed. The girl's lawyer leaned forward. "You said you saw him. Can you describe exactly what happened?" She nodded, swallowing hard. "I was walking home. It was late, but I wasn't scared. I do it all the time. But then I heard something, angry voices. I got closer, and that's when I saw him. He was yelling at someone, pushing them. The man looked scared. She looked straight at the officer. He wasn't supposed to do that." The officer's jaw tightened. "This is ridiculous. She's a kid. Kids don't always remember things right." His words came fast, almost defensive. But the girl didn't back down. "I remember everything," she said firmly. The judge adjusted his glasses, his gaze shifting between them. "Continue," he said, directing the words at her. She straightened. "I stayed quiet, hiding behind the trash bins. I was scared, but I wanted to know what was happening." The man was on the ground, and the officer, he looked around, like he was checking if anyone could see him. Then he kicked him, hard. Gasps echoed in the courtroom. The officer's face darkened, his lips pressing into a tight line. "She's lying," he said sharply. "There's no proof." The girl's lawyer raised a hand. "Let her finish." The girl hesitated for only a second before continuing. "I heard the man say, 'Please stop.' He was heard." But the officer just laughed. Her small fingers curled into fists at the memory. "Then I took out my phone. I recorded it." Silence. The officer's face turned pale. The confidence drained from his posture, his shoulders tensing. "What?" His voice was low, almost a whisper. The girl nodded. "I recorded everything." She reached into her pocket, pulling out a small, old phone. "It's all here." The courtroom erupted. People murmured, shifting in their seats. Some leaned forward, eyes wide, waiting for what would happen next. The officer's lawyer leaned in, whispering something urgently into his ear, but he barely seemed to hear it. His eyes were locked on the girl, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked painful. The judge straightened in his seat. "If there is video evidence, it will be reviewed." "Bailiff, collect the phone." The little girl handed it over, her hands steady. She had been waiting for this moment for so long, carrying that recording with her, knowing one day she would need to show the truth. The officer turned slightly in his chair, his eyes scanning the room as if looking for a way out. The smirk was completely gone now. In its place was something else, something close to fear. And the girl? She just stood there, watching him, knowing that for the first time, he was the one who had something to be afraid of. The courtroom was no longer just a place of legal proceedings. It had become a battlefield. The moment the bailiff took the girl's phone, all eyes shifted toward the judge. The officer's lawyer whispered furiously in his ear, his expression tight with concern, but the officer barely reacted. His confidence had cracked, and for the first time, there was doubt in his eyes. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked at the little girl. "This video," he said slowly, "if it is what you claim it to be, could change everything." His voice was calm, but there was a heaviness in his words. He gestured toward the bailiff. "We will review it." A hushed murmur spread through the courtroom. The officer clenched his jaw, his fingers gripping the armrest of his chair. His lawyer cleared his throat and stood. "Your Honor, before we proceed, I must remind the court that witness testimony from a child is not always reliable. Memories can be influenced, details can be exaggerated." The girl's lawyer cut in smoothly, "Which is exactly why the video evidence is crucial. It's not about memory. It's about facts." The officer's lawyer hesitated, then nodded slightly. "Then we should also consider the possibility of manipulation. Who's to say this recording hasn't been altered?" The girl's lawyer exhaled sharply. Are you suggesting a 9-year-old child tampered with digital evidence? The courtroom was silent. The officer's lawyer pursed his lips but didn't respond. Meanwhile, in the gallery, a woman sat with her hands folded in her lap, her knuckles turning white. She had been silent this entire time, watching, waiting. She was the officer's wife. Her face, normally composed, showed the faintest trace of distress. She had heard rumors before, whispers about her husband's conduct, but she had always dismissed them. Now, watching the little girl stand there with such certainty, she wasn't sure what to believe anymore. Beside her, another figure sat stiffly, a man in a dark suit. Unlike the others in the gallery, his expression was unreadable. He had no personal stake in this case, yet his presence felt heavy. He was internal affairs. He had been watching this officer for a long time, waiting for something concrete. Now he was wondering if this child had provided exactly that. At the defense table, the officer finally spoke. "This is absurd," he muttered under his breath, but there was no force behind his words. He had dealt with accusations before, but none had ever come with proof. None had ever come from a child brave enough to stand against him. The judge glanced toward the bailiff, then toward the prosecutor. "We will review the footage in chambers. Court is in recess." The gavel hit the desk, but no one moved at first. It was as if everyone was waiting for something else to happen. The little girl stepped down from the stand, her eyes still locked on the officer. He didn't look at her, but she saw his fingers twitch slightly as if resisting the urge to do something. Anything to regain control of the situation. Her lawyer placed a hand on her shoulder. "You did great," he whispered. She nodded but didn't say anything. She wasn't done yet. As the courtroom emptied, the officer's wife hesitated before rising. She cast one final look at her husband before stepping out, her face unreadable. The internal affairs officer followed shortly after, pulling out his phone as he walked, making a call that could change the course of everything. In the hallway, reporters gathered, their cameras flashing, their voices blending into a chaotic hum of questions. The little girl's mother wrapped an arm around her daughter, shielding her from the noise. "Mom," the girl said quietly, "what if they don't believe me?" Her mother crouched to her level, brushing a curl away from her face. "They will," she said, "because the truth always comes out." But even as she said the words, she couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling in her gut. Because she knew, sometimes the truth wasn't enough. The hallway outside the courtroom buzzed with tension. The little girl clutched her mother's hand tightly as they moved past reporters, their cameras flashing, their voices overlapping in a storm of questions. Her lawyer walked ahead, his expression unreadable, focused. The stakes had shifted. A single piece of evidence now held the power to expose everything, and yet there was still so much uncertainty. Behind them, the officer exited the courtroom, his movements stiff and controlled. He avoided eye contact with everyone, but his presence alone sent a ripple of unease through the crowd. He was no longer untouchable, and he knew it. His lawyer trailed closely, whispering something urgent, but the officer barely acknowledged him. His mind was elsewhere. The judge had retreated to his chambers to review the footage. The outcome now rested in his hands, and the weight of that decision loomed over everyone. The little girl's mother exhaled sharply, leading her daughter toward a quieter corner of the hallway. "You okay?" she asked gently. The girl nodded, but her fingers trembled slightly as she held onto the fabric of her dress. She wasn't scared. Not exactly. But the air felt heavy, as if something unseen was pressing down on all of them. Across the hall, the officer's wife stood with her arms folded, her gaze distant. She had seen him walk out of that courtroom, his usual confidence faltering. It was a side of him she had never witnessed before. Or maybe she had just ignored it. A few feet away, the internal affairs officer leaned against the wall, his phone still in his hand. His instincts told him that this was bigger than anyone realized. If that footage was as damning as the girl claimed, it wouldn't just be one officer facing consequences. It could unravel an entire system of unchecked power. Time moved slowly, each second stretching into the next. Then finally, a court clerk stepped forward, clearing her throat. "The judge has reached a decision," she announced. A hush fell over the crowd. The girl's mother squeezed her daughter's hand. The officer straightened his posture, his jaw tightening. The internal affairs officer slipped his phone back into his pocket and stood upright, fully attentive. One by one, they filed back into the courtroom. The atmosphere had shifted. Before, there had been speculation, arguments, defenses. Now there was only waiting. The judge sat at his bench, his expression unreadable. The courtroom was silent as he adjusted his glasses and looked at the officer. "I have reviewed the footage," he said, his voice steady. The words sent a ripple of tension through the room. The little girl held her breath. The officer remained motionless, though a flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes. The judge continued, "And based on what I have seen, it is clear that." The doors at the back of the courtroom burst open. A young man in a suit rushed in, his face flushed. He carried a folder in one hand and a phone in the other. "Your Honor," he called out, his voice urgent. "There's something you need to see." The sudden interruption sent a wave of confusion through the courtroom. The girl's lawyer frowned, glancing at the newcomer. The officer's lawyer immediately stood. "Who is this?" he demanded. The young man ignored him, walking straight to the judge's bench. He leaned in, whispering something quickly. The judge's brows furrowed, then his eyes widened just slightly. He gestured toward the bailiff. "Take a look at this," he instructed. The courtroom remained dead silent as the bailiff accepted the phone, tapping on the screen. Then suddenly his eyes darkened. His jaw tightened. He turned the device back to the judge. The judge took a slow breath before shifting his gaze toward the officer. "You have some explaining to do," he said gravely. The little girl's heart pounded. Whatever had just been revealed had changed everything. The officer's lawyer stiffened, whispering furiously to his client. But the officer didn't speak. He simply stared ahead, his face unreadable. The tension in the room was suffocating. No one knew exactly what was happening, but one thing was certain: this wasn't over yet. The officer's face remained unreadable, but his grip tightened on the table in front of him. The tension in the courtroom thickened as the judge handed the phone back to the bailiff, his expression dark and unreadable. The little girl watched carefully, her small hands clenched into fists in her lap. She didn't understand everything that was happening, but she knew one thing for certain: something big had just changed. The young man who had rushed in with the evidence stood firm, his chest rising and falling with each steady breath. The officer's lawyer was already protesting. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. We were not informed of any new evidence." The judge silenced him with a single look. "Sit down, counselor." His voice was calm, but the weight of his words made it clear that this was no longer a game. He turned back toward the young man. "Explain yourself." The man cleared his throat, glancing at the little girl for just a second before speaking. "Your Honor, this evidence was just recovered from a secure server." It appears the officer in question attempted to erase it, but a backup was made without his knowledge. The courtroom erupted into whispers. The officer's jaw tightened. His lawyer leaned in, whispering something furiously in his ear, but the officer didn't respond. He just stared at the judge, his face blank, but his eyes burning with something unspoken. The judge exhaled slowly before turning to the bailiff. "Play the video." The screen at the front of the courtroom flickered to life. At first, the footage was shaky, as if the camera had been knocked off balance. Then the image steadied, and the truth unfolded before everyone's eyes. The little girl gasped. It was the same night she had described in her testimony. The same dimly lit street, the same fear she had felt deep in her chest. But now it wasn't just her word against his. Now there was proof. The officer on the screen was pacing, his voice low and sharp. Another man, barely visible in the frame, was speaking with him. Their conversation was muffled at first, but as the video continued, the words became clearer. "No one's gonna believe some kid," the officer on the screen said, his voice filled with certainty. "And if they do, it won't matter. I'll handle it." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The officer sitting at the defendant's table stiffened, his face pale. His lawyer ran a hand over his forehead, already scrambling for a response. The footage continued, revealing more than anyone had expected. The officer had lied, and not just about that night. He had covered up evidence before. He had manipulated reports. And he had done it all with the confidence that no one would ever challenge him. The little girl's mother covered her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. The internal affairs officer in the back of the courtroom crossed his arms, his expression unreadable, but his eyes sharp. This case was no longer just about a single incident. It was about something much larger. The judge turned off the screen, his expression unreadable. "Officer," he said slowly, his voice dangerously calm. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" For the first time, the officer hesitated. His confidence had cracked, the walls he had built around himself beginning to crumble. He looked at his lawyer, at the courtroom, at the little girl. His jaw clenched. And then, for the first time that day, he spoke. "I want a deal." The entire courtroom fell silent. The little girl's breath caught in her throat. A deal. Was he about to admit everything? The judge leaned forward slightly. "Are you confessing, officer?" The officer's face darkened. He was trapped, and he knew it. His options were gone, his power slipping through his fingers. "I want immunity," he said instead. "Because if you think I'm the only one involved in this, you're wrong." The room erupted. The internal affairs officer pushed off the wall, suddenly alert. The judge's expression hardened. The little girl stared in shock. This wasn't just about her case anymore. It was bigger than she had ever imagined. And the truth was only just beginning to come out. The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. Everyone processed the officer's words, but no one spoke. The little girl's mother gripped her daughter's hand, her heart pounding. The judge leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly against the desk as he studied the man before him. "You're saying there's more." The judge's voice was steady, but the weight behind his words was impossible to ignore. The officer's face was tight, his usual arrogance replaced with something close to desperation. He swallowed hard. "Yes," he said, his voice quieter now. "There are others. If I go down alone, they'll bury me. But if I talk, I need protection." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the courtroom. The internal affairs officer at the back stepped forward, finally speaking. "Your Honor, we'll take this into consideration, but we need to know exactly what he's offering." The officer hesitated, his gaze flickering toward the little girl. For a brief second, something almost like shame crossed his face. Then with a deep breath, he spoke. "Evidence, names, records, everything." The judge didn't react right away. His gaze was cold, unreadable. Then he turned to the prosecutor. "Do you have a recommendation?" The prosecutor stood, glancing at the little girl and her mother before looking back at the judge. "Your Honor, we're willing to listen to what he has. But his crimes cannot be ignored. If he cooperates, we ask that his sentence be reduced, not erased." The officer's lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently. The officer's hands clenched into fists. He was used to having control, to being the one calling the shots. But now he had no choice. He could either take the deal or risk going down alone. Finally, he exhaled. "Fine," he muttered. "I'll tell you everything." The tension in the room shifted. The little girl sat up straighter, her heart racing. After everything she had been through, after standing in front of a room full of adults who doubted her, the truth was finally coming out. The judge nodded. "Then we'll proceed. But let me be clear, if you hold anything back, this deal is off the table." The officer looked away, nodding stiffly. Just as everyone thought the case had taken its final turn, the internal affairs officer spoke again. "Your Honor, before we move forward, there's something else the court should be aware of." The room stilled once more. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Go on." The IA officer reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick file. "We've been investigating corruption within the department for months. This case was never just about this officer. It's about a much larger network. And thanks to the bravery of one little girl, we now have the final piece we needed to bring them down." The little girl's mother gasped, covering her mouth. The officer's face drained of color. The judge took the file, flipping through the pages, his face growing more serious with each passing second. He finally looked up, his eyes locking onto the officer's. "It seems you're not just looking at a reduced sentence anymore," he said. "You're about to become the key witness in one of the biggest corruption trials this city has ever seen." The officer opened his mouth to argue, but he knew there was no way out. His shoulders sagged, and for the first time, he looked truly defeated. The little girl watched it all unfold, her small fingers tightening around her mother's. She had been scared. She had been doubted. But she had never backed down. And now, because of her, justice was finally being served. The judge turned his attention to her, his expression softening just a little. "Young lady," he said, "you've shown more courage than most adults ever will. This courtroom owes you a debt of gratitude." A slow smile spread across her face. She had come here thinking no one would listen. But now, as she looked around the room, she knew one thing for sure. Her voice had made a difference. The courtroom was still buzzing with murmurs as the judge finalized his decision. The officer, once confident and untouchable, sat slumped in his chair, staring blankly ahead. His entire world had shifted in an instant. He was no longer the one in control. Now he was at the mercy of the system he had manipulated for so long. The little girl held onto her mother's hand, her small fingers trembling slightly. She had never imagined herself standing in a courtroom, let alone being the reason a corrupt officer was finally facing justice. But now, looking around the room, she could feel the weight of what she had accomplished. She had done something that even some adults were too afraid to do. The judge cleared his throat, regaining the room's attention. Given the new evidence and the defendant's willingness to cooperate, this case will now move forward in coordination with the larger investigation. He turned toward the officer. "You will remain in custody until further hearings. Your cooperation may determine the final outcome of your sentence." The officer only nodded, his face pale. He knew there was no escaping this. As the gavel struck, signaling the court's adjournment, the little girl exhaled deeply. It was over, or at least her part in it was. She looked up at her mother, who smiled down at her, eyes shining with pride. "You were so brave," her mother whispered, pulling her into a tight embrace. "I'm so proud of you." Reporters and cameras waited outside the courthouse, eager to capture the moment. As they stepped out into the sunlight, microphones were pushed toward them, voices overlapping with questions. "How does it feel to have taken down a corrupt officer?" Were you scared to testify? What message do you want to send to others? The little girl hesitated, overwhelmed by this sudden attention. But then she remembered why she had done all of this, not for fame, not for recognition, but for justice. Taking a deep breath, she met the eyes of the reporters. "I just wanted to tell the truth," she said simply. "No one believed me at first, but the truth always matters. It doesn't matter how small you are, your voice counts." Her words struck something deep in the crowd. Even the toughest reporters seemed momentarily caught off guard. A murmur of agreement passed through them, and the cameras kept flashing, capturing this moment in history. Later that evening, as she sat curled up on the couch with her mother, the news played on the television. Her name was everywhere, her story being told across the country. People called her a hero, but she didn't feel like one. She had just done what was right. Her mother brushed her hair back gently. "You changed things today," she said. "Not just for yourself, but for so many people." The little girl thought about that for a moment. It was strange to think that her voice, something people had once ignored, had now made such a big difference. But as she watched the news, as she saw people reacting to her story, she realized something. If she could stand up and make a difference, maybe others could too. Maybe someone somewhere who was too afraid to speak up would now find the courage to do so. A small smile tugged at her lips. The battle wasn't over. There would always be people who abused power, who tried to silence others. But today, she had proven that even the smallest voice could shake the world. And that was just the beginning.